G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Welcome back to the Wealth and Wisdom podcast. Today we've got audio from a webinar I recently hosted for Beef 24's Next Generation Committee on preparing for succession. I'm joined by panel guests Ruth Corrigan, a fifth-generation beef producer, and Jeremy Hutchings, head coach and managing director of the Farm Owners Academy. We discuss the stats around why succession plans so often fail and address the factors you need to know if you want your family to be successful. Jeremy and Ruth had some really great wisdom to share, which I know will be really well received. So strap yourself in and let's get cracking.
Hello and welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to the second in the new series of webinars launched by Beef Australia's Next Gen Committee, Preparing Yourself for Succession. I'm Georgia Dale, Next Gen Committee member from Black Box Co. As their client manager, and I'm based in Springsure in central Queensland. Joining me tonight, I also have fellow committee member Jordan Watson from Cultivate Agri Partnerships. She's zooming in from Blackall. And Kate Drury, Suncorp Bank, zooming in from Condamine. A very warm welcome to our guest speakers, Ben Law, Jeremy Hutchings, and Ruth Corrigan. Joining us tonight to cover a very compelling topic, succession.
Firstly, I just want to say thanks to the Next Gen Committee for giving me this invitation and with the guest speakers, I've been really looking forward to it. So we're going to be talking about succession today. And unfortunately, succession's a topic that's pretty much sometimes feel like it's been done to death. And it still happens to be arguably one of the biggest problems facing rural Australia long term. And most people say, well, why? And the reason is with most problems, there's usually a complex array of reasons why they exist. And therefore, there's a complex array of solutions. There's no simple fix and no silver bullet, which I know most people are looking for. So when the committee offered me this chance to come on, I decided we need to take a bit of a different tact to what we normally do. Now, in this webinar, we're going to dig into the main reasons why so many succession plans fail. And then we're going to discuss the solutions so that you, the next gen, are armed with the knowledge to improve your chances of success in that space. Now, for many of you today, you're probably thinking, well, succession's not on my radar, or I'm not in line for a family succession at the moment. But what I can tell you is the things you'll learn will help you in not only in a succession, but it'll also help you succeed in your career and life. Now, Jordan, if I can just go over to you, I just want to run some stats by everyone. So anyone that's got a pen, I need you to write these down because they're really important. A number of years ago, I stumbled over some research that came out of the US and it had these stats in it. And I won't go into the details of it other than, I've spent 25 years in this space studying the topic, and I think it pretty accurately reflects rural succession in Australia. And now what I want you to do is write them down, but I don't want you to fixate on the exact percentages. I just want you to get a sense of what the key issues are and therefore what the potential solutions are. So why do such a high proportion of succession plannings fail, and what are the reasons? Number one, which I thought would be a lot higher, is professional advisor errors. That's the first one. Number two is a lack of a strategic plan. That's about 12% of the reasons. So number one's professional advisor errors. That's 3% of the reason. A lack of a family development mission or a strategic plan is 25% of the reason. Number three is a failure to prepare the next generation to take over. That's 25% of the reason. But 60% of the reason, which is really the bulk of it, is a breakdown in communication and trust. And so my experience over the years is those last two, which is the failure to prepare the next gen coming through and communication and trust, are absolutely the lion's share. And this is why one of my experiences has been is that when you go to an accountant or a lawyer, and more often than not, they're really good at what they do and they're really smart, but they don't have the solutions. That happens all the time. So now that you've got those stats, thanks for that, Jordan. I'm going to introduce the panel guests. So first, we've got Jeremy Hutchings from Farm Owners Academy. Jeremy is the managing director and lead business coach at Farm Owners, and he combines a lifelong passion for ag with over 25 years experience, about the same number as I've got, in business management and consulting. He studied agricultural science, economics and trade, and he actually lives on his own farm near Cootamundra, New South Wales with his family. And he's absolutely dedicated to guiding Farm Owners Academy in empowering farming families to achieve their business and personal goals. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Jeremy tonight. Secondly, we've got Ruth Corrigan. Ruth's a fifth generation farmer. So, you know, to have made it to the fifth generation, you must be doing something well, Ruth. And she's an owner manager of Rennie Pastoral Company in southern New South Wales. She actually works with her parents, Brian and Lucinda, her younger brother, Anthony, and a team of 8 staff. And she came back within a succession plan and joined the family business in 2014, and they market over 600 seed stock bulls annually. She's got a degree in livestock science from UNE, a postgrad in climate change and agriculture, and has completed the Rabobank Farm Managers Program. And for those of you who might heard, she's also got 2 young children, and she's been through the succession herself. 10 seconds or less, myself, I grew up in a cattle and cropping property in New South Wales. I did an ag economics degree, and I spent 20 years as a financial advisor. So I've been in this space for a long time. But I hung up my financial advisor boots in 2020, and I now run the Financial Bloke podcast and act as a family strategic coach for a small number of driven, successful, intergenerational farming families. So now we know who everyone is. I just want to get cracking and get stuck into this. So, firstly, what we want to say is we've been talking about succession being a problem in ag forever. And I want to start with Jeremy. So realistically, Jeremy, we should have sorted this issue out by now, but we haven't, mate. With all the seminars, workshops, facilitators, resources, etc., that are available, and considering all those stats we just talked about, mate, why do you think that so many families are still struggling with succession?
It's a great question, Ben, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Just wish I could get up to Beef Week. Ben, I think firstly it is a really complex issue, and a lot of farmers think that it's a moment in time. They need to have a meeting with their accountant or with someone and sort it out. But for me, succession, and for the way we think about it, it's a journey and it's part of good business practice over time. And so a lot of farming families just aren't treating it that way, and they're not necessarily making it part of their business planning and their communication long term. And coming back to the stats that you just mentioned, Ben, it's about trust, respect, and communication. And there's a lot of deeper work that needs to be done amongst family relationships to take a farming family from where they are to moving through something as complex as succession really professionally. The other overlay, I think, 2 things. One is there is a lot of fear that word succession brings up, especially perhaps in the incumbent generation. What they don't want to do by opening up on the whole topic of succession is open up the hornet's nest, because they haven't necessarily got the skills as the leaders in the family to deal with that if that happens. And so I think there's some very real issues that are very real for the older generation or the incumbent generation that keeps them from being as proactive as they might be in leading their families through the process. But for me, in and around all of those, there's also a key point, which is as farmers, we're technically trained. You know, we're great in the paddock, and there's so much R&D and extension and support and around growing faster crops and better animals. But there is very little training out there on some of the key skills that we need, and succession is a leadership issue. The skills that we need as CEOs and business owners of really complex and significant farms to navigate succession and to lead our families through it really well.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. Perfect, Jeremy. That's great, mate. Thanks for that. Ruth, would you like to jump in on that and add some of your comments? Because going through the succession process yourself, I know you don't get to see everyone else in the marketplace and what happens on like Jeremy and I probably do. But from your experience, what are you seeing out there, or what are your initial thoughts?
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Jeremy. And thanks to the Next Gen Committee for inviting me on. I'm definitely by no means an expert on succession, so I really will just talk to my own experiences tonight. But I think, a lot of what Jeremy just said from what we've been through, I think communication and revisiting the process continually once it starts over a long period of time. I think we started as a family back in 2008 or something. So it's 15 years down the track, and something that we do regularly, and you've got to keep at, and you've got to actually, have a formal process, and actions have got to come out of it. So I think someone, and Jeremy also spoke about it, but someone in the business that can drive the process and it has those skills. So not necessarily the technical farmer. You really need that person, and in our case we do, and has been my mum and not my dad. So yes, it requires, I suppose, a pretty broad skill set to make it happen. And then I think scale can be an issue for family farming businesses, and in the majority of cases, when you're talking about succession to the next generation, there's not always the scale for someone for the succession of a viable farm business in the traditional sense, and and the rest of the family members to be adequately catered for, whether that's the same or not the same. But that's a few thoughts of mine.
Well, I think they're all pretty relevant because, like we said, I said in the beginning, is a complex array of problems. And when I was back being a financial advisor, one of the number one issues I'd see, people would come to me and say, hey, we need to do a succession. I'd like to retire now. And there's no off-farm assets. There's no retirement assets being built up. So therefore, the next generation has to take on a huge amount of debt to retire mum and dad. And there's not enough equity in the position. And then it all comes to a screaming halt. So for me, I think there were some really good points in there, Ruth. What I'd say is one other area that I find really important to know is that everyone looks to mum and dad for the solutions. Everyone sits down and says, mum and dad hasn't started the discussion. We're waiting for mum and dad to do something. We're waiting for them to go see the accountant. And everyone just sits there waiting, and then it becomes a frustration. So I think a big problem is that we need to encourage the next generation, like we're doing today, to actually upskill and be the champion of the family and start to progress towards that, and not wait until it becomes a problem point where it all boils over. Yeah, Jeremy, I can see your hand up, mate. I'd love to hear what you think.
And I just want to encourage the next generation and to do that with respect. I think for me, that's key in building trust and fostering good communication. Turn up and say, hey guys, you haven't nailed, you're not driving succession. What are you doing? And make that our parents wrong. That's one way to do it. But turn up and sit with them and say, hey, we really want to make sure we get this right and continue your legacy. What do you want? And what do you want for the family? And how would you like to see this play out? And how can we help?
Yeah, that's perfect, Jeremy. And what I like to always say is, if you find out what mum and dad want, Once mum and dad get what they want, usually it makes the whole process a whole lot easier, and especially when you do it with respect, as Jeremy mentioned. And, that personal development, I personally believe, is the leadership and communication skills. If you can get the communication right, then you can deal with most of the roadblocks that you hit. Perfect. Thanks, Jeremy. That was great. Ruth, we're going to put you on the spotlight now because you've got a great story. So you've actually been through the succession process yourself, as you mentioned. And we had a chat about this a few weeks ago. And so far, I'm sure there's been some difficult conversations and some roadblocks you've had to get over. But for the most part, it seemed to have worked, hasn't it? Now, for you, how was the process actually for you going through it in hindsight? And can you give us a sense of what you think the family really did well to make that happen?
Yeah, no worries, Ben. So I guess a bit of background. So I joined the business in 2014, and I was 26 at the time. And I now work with a younger brother, and he came back into the business in 2016. But we the deal always was, I suppose, with our parents, that if we wanted to, go farming and come back, that we went and got off farm, did some training, be it uni, be it a trade. I went to UNE, did ag science as such, and my younger brother's a diesel mechanic, so and worked off farm before for a few years post uni, worked on a station when I finished school, so got a bit of experience, and then decided to join the business. And I guess that had been a long-term goal of mine from a young age, and I'd expressed that to my parents, so we talked about all that. I think one of the great things when I came home was I spent a couple of years as a working under a farm manager, and as well as my dad, he had an assistant manager at the time, and I really had the opportunity to learn off him and off another very experienced manager in our business who was also a non-family member. So I think that mentoring and just developing, good technical skills in your 20s is really important. And then about after 3 years or so, I took on a farm manager role when this assistant manager left. So then I really did that for probably 4 years until I had my first baby, and I have since put on a farm manager who I spend a lot of time talking to, and but he runs the day-to-day operations now on the farm I was managing. So and I do a bit of HR and sort of all the breeding genetics in our business. But I think the things that really were important when I made some notes, but the things that were really important when I moved home was that when came into the business, we had clearly defined, my brother and I had clearly defined roles, and we had position descriptions, and we both came in and went on to wages. So this is, I guess, not always the case. People work in farm businesses for drawings or promises, but we went on to industry relevant wages, so we were on the same playing field as the other non-family employees in the business. And I think the business we've continued to grow in that time, and scale has really allowed space and actually geographical separation between family members, and that is, I think, really important. And it's probably something I've seen in other businesses where there's not enough space, particularly once people get married and have kids, and but we all live on different farms, and we do have very different skill sets. So I guess that's that's a real positive when you can. It wouldn't work if we all lived on the same farm. That's for sure. So I think that's one of the very important things. So in terms of a formal process, we didn't actually use not for the whole process. We didn't really use a dedicated succession planner, which is not something I'm advocating, but in our case we didn't, and it was really a process driven, by the family and in conjunction with some really good professional advice from lawyers, accountants, and one sort of succession planner. So I think, good professional advice is really important. And I suppose I mentioned earlier, but it's been something that we've revisited regularly in the 10 years since I've been home. So it's a continuous process. We always say no cattle yard conversations. So whenever we discuss these things, they're always recorded in minutes, and there's no promises made behind the scenes, and it's I suppose a transparent process. So I think some other things, I suppose I guess that in your, when you're working out what you want to do, being driven by doing something you love as opposed to being driven by, I think, getting good technical skills, and as opposed to being driven by money or wages, or that's quite an important thing, and probably a level of patience, because there's certainly, it wasn't always beer and Skittles. There was, as you said, Ben, challenging conversations along the way, and definitely some resistance from the older generation to hand over responsibility and decision-making authority. And I think in my case, that probably took, 5 years plus to be able to come in and make changes in the business. So I think, Jeremy said respect, and that's probably a big part of it, but respect and some patience, and I think and continuing to get good skills, and to upskill yourself, and do some training while you're in your 20s, and I think that's also really important. I suppose the other point I'd made was that there's quite a clear distinction, and I know we spoke about it, between succession of the business and the management, and then succession of the land, and that's something that we dealt with from early on. And my parents, they operated a partnership, and they transitioned to a family trust. So the land and the business was separated from the early, before I joined the business, and then the land was leased back to the business. So we were really employees of the business, and now my brother and I have just become, partners in the business. So we have some ownership over the business and the cattle, but the land is, the land is separate, and is still held by my parents. So I guess that's quite a separate issue to transitioning the actual day-to-day management and the business management. So that's probably where I'm at. Did you want?
No, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
I was just going to add in, and Jeremy might have something. We'll get Jeremy's thoughts in a minute. But one of the things you mentioned, which really resonated with me when we had this chat the other day, was the thing about having mum driving this. The first question is, do you think it would have succeeded if mum hadn't been driving it? And was mum really the the person that brought everyone back to the table when there were hard discussions?
Do I think it would have succeeded? I probably, I'd like to hope so.
Or do you think it would have been substantially harder then, or a higher chance of
Yeah,
problems?
I'm not sure that. I think I think we've both in our 30s have better, much broader skills to be able to deal with this stuff. But definitely in my mid 20s, I probably wasn't capable of driving that sort of process. And maybe if she hadn't driven it, we would have had somebody like yourself to run the process for us. But it definitely her owning the process and has made it on the whole a successful one.
Because why I point that out, Ruth, is because in my experience, what happens is with succession is people start off with all good intentions and they hit a roadblock and they just get stuck there and they go, oh, it's too hard, this won't work. And then they finally get back on the horse, they go a little bit further again, then they hit another roadblock and it's like, oh, it's all too hard, and they stop again. Whereas if you've got someone in the family that is patient, respectful, and could drive that whole process over and not expecting it to happen in like 6 months or 3 weeks or 3 years, like this is a long-term project. So I think that's a really important point that families need to realize is, it requires discipline and consistency, which it sounds like mum must have had plenty of that, Ruth.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So no, it kept us on the straight and narrow. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Jeremy, mate, I know you'll be wanting to jump in there, mate. So go for it. What do you got to say?
I think it's a really good example, Ruth, and thank you for sharing about succession done well. And it does confirm to your point, Ben, that it is a journey and it's a long-term play, isn't it? But I think succession's misunderstood. And I think we make succession an elephant when in fact it doesn't need to be. And we believe that 90% of what succession is can be resolved just by good business practice. So there's transition of management, and then there's transfer of the land asset. And I think what Ruth outlined is that they had real clarity on those two distinctions and those two things. I think we can learn so much out from small business and business outside of agriculture. You think about the accounting firm or the law firm or the financial planning firm, Ben, or any other business. They've got young accountants, lawyers coming through the system, and when they tick a few boxes, they get invited to be a junior director of the firm. Succession is happening in those businesses all of the time. And so, yes, they get more and more responsibility, and they come through a career path and through a structure, and when they've earned the right, they get the opportunity, like Ruth and her brother have, to buy into the operating entity. Now, I think I'd love to see that most or all farm businesses have to rent, or a business, an operating entity like that, and they pay a rent to the owners of the land, because that's exactly what most accounting firms, law firms, vet practices, physios do. They all have to operate and be successful and make it all work after they've paid a rent to the landlord. And who owns the premises that those businesses operate out of doesn't really matter, because the thing that drives cash and drives the business is the operating entity that sits on top of the asset. And I think, to Ruth and her family's credit, they made that distinction, and they've given the younger generation the opportunity to take equity and participate in the business that runs the farm. And what happens with transfer of ownership of the entity can be a completely separate and a completely isolated and different discussion than who gets the next ute, who gets the upgrade on the house, who la-di-da. None of that's succession. That's just should be sorted out with good communication, good governance, and good business practice. So I think breaking it down into its parts, as Ruth and her family have done so well, is just so important. But if we can, and then apply good business practice and run our farms professionally and really work to do that over time, then succession can become what it's supposed to be about, which is just the transfer of the land asset at some point in time.
think that's some really valid points there, Jeremy. And if I talk to the people that I've worked with over the years that have businesses outside of the agriculture sector, they're always mystified that nobody has a disaster recovery plan or a transition plan for when the owners get old enough to retire. So it's very, very much unique to the agricultural space. So I think that's a really valid point. I think also too, Ruth, by having those conversations over how long have you been in this process so far? Did you say since 2014?
No, I started working in the business in 2014, so
Yep.
2008, I think. So
Yeah.
at least 15 years.
Yeah. So that's the point. And how old were you then, Ruth, when those discussions started?
About 20, 19 or 20.
Yeah. Yep.
But my younger brother would have still been at school.
Yeah. And there's a real value in actually having those discussions when the next generation is quite young, is because then they can start to prepare and think, okay, well, I've got a future or I haven't got a future. What skills do I need to get? You start to understand that this is a transition over a period of time, not just an event. Because I think that's where a lot of problems kick in, is your plan that you're in with the family is just part of the business cycle. Like it's not a day hits and that's when succession happens. So I think that's a really important point for everyone to know. And then when you are the younger generation coming through, you can go and upskill and know that I'm actually getting somewhere. I'm learning all the skills I need to do to be able to ultimately take over some sort of responsibility. Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Ruth. Now, we're going to head into Jeremy. Jeremy, mate, as the Managing Director of Farm Owners Academy, you'll have seen a lot of successful and unsuccessful farming operations or agricultural operations, and also succession plans. I'll just call it farming operations. Now, let's say you jumped in the time machine and you were able to go back to in your early 20s to mid 20s, let's just say between 20 and 30, not saying you're not all that far off that. But what would you be doing right now to set yourself up for absolute success? Now, that could be, I've got a succession plan with my family to go back to, or I want to smash it out of the park career-wise.
I think one thing my father always insisted on us is that we go and have a good look around before we make the decision to come home. And I think that's really sound advice. He wasn't going to let us home for a good few years until we'd had the opportunity to work, to your point, Ruth, under some other good mentors and good managers and get some experience from outside the industry in agribusiness or other, so that we brought some skills home. When we come home, I would focus on and Ruth, I think, again, is a great example of becoming the very best farm manager that I can. And I think I mentioned before that most farmers are technically trained and we're great in the paddock, but we haven't necessarily learned the skills of how to run a great business. And I went through ag college, uni, corporate finance, then into farm consulting. And nowhere in that journey did I learn how to run and scale a successful business like a successful entrepreneur. It wasn't until I got into business coaching that I really learned how to run and scale a business. And so for me, if you can be a crackerjack technical farm manager and then even overlay the CEO type skill set, I think we've got to acknowledge that farming is one of the most complex types of businesses that you can run, with the markets and the seasons and running teams and contractors and suppliers. And, there's so many moving parts that sometimes we neglect to remember, or we forget that we need CEO level skill set. So I'd suggest that if I was talking to a 25-year-old self, I would say, go and get that business skill set, negotiation, communication, leadership, finance, strategy, HR, and management, and then get on farm and apply those skills, and then come home so that you are as attractive as you can be as the incumbent generation, if that makes sense.
I think sorry, Jeremy, I was just going to say, I think that last point's really important, because if you do go away and you do come back and you've become a rock star in your field, it makes it very hard for the family to go, we don't want you involved. Like, it takes away a lot of those objections about capacity or competence. Now, I know sometimes we run into the older generation that gets a little bit stuck in their ways and may not see it that way. But if you can become a rock star in your field, it makes it so much easier, doesn't it?
I just think it has you arrive with bandwidth and capacity, and you will get the real respect from. I mean, if we take family out for a moment, those junior accountants that make it through to being a director of the accounting firm are the ones that stand out professionally. And so it's the same in any business. So just become a really attractive farm manager and business manager, so that when you arrive home, that you're giving yourself the best chance to progress within the family business. Ruth, I'd be really keen in your comment on that. Do you agree or have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Jeremy. I think and I reckon, or maybe it's amplified if you're you're a woman and you have kids in your 30s, but I think, moving for jobs and learning off people in your 20s and, in good companies or small business, either or, but getting that experience and, and being able to move and being flexible and doing things for the experience and probably not the money is really important in your 20s, because it all changes pretty quickly. And yeah, I think you need to have that experience under your belt. So yeah, absolutely. And I guess I don't know, at times I probably thought, it would have been good for me to have worked to have done a bit more experience off farm. And but time, I guess timing wise, when I came home, my dad was 65, and I think timing wise that it actually worked well for us. I think he, the difference now, where he's in his mid-70s, is the time passes, and if you're gonna get it, had he been younger, that may have been a different equation, I think. Yeah, anyway, that's just a thought. I do sometimes think it would have been good to to have done some more stuff.
Ruth, if you just come in there, one of the things that I found when I was younger is I chased, when I got out of university and I went into the professional advice career, and I chased the money a lot of the time. So I actually went out and it was about, I wanted to climb that ladder as quick as I could and get paid as much as I could, because I wanted to build my own wealth and make my own way in the world. And if I look back now, that point really rings true with me. I think if I had my time back again, I did chase the better firms to work in but I wish I'd done more of that. I wish I'd focused more on getting that really solid, good experience from good valued, good operators, so I could have built my personal capital quicker. Because I think that pays off long term. Your personal skills will yield a dividend for a lot longer than a few extra dollars an hour you get in your 20s.
Yeah, I suppose there's different ways to go about it, but I think definitely that moving for jobs and doing stuff while you're not tied down is really important. Yeah.
Perfect. Righto. Well, we're getting right up near the end. I know I was given we've got a hard question time at 1:15. So, Jeremy, is there anything else you'd like to give as a final comment, mate, before we go over into the questions in a few minutes?
Yeah, when we look, Ben, at what is missing that supports good succession in family farms, and just as an example, when we have our members come together at Farm Owners Academy, 300 farmers in a room, we ask them to put their hand up. Who here has really strong understanding of their farm's financial performance? Who here has a benchmark and a budget, and they measure their performance against their budget diligently? Less than 10% of the room put their hand up. And then the next question we ask is, who here has a really clear, documented, cohesive strategic plan that your family is aligned to? And less than 10% put their hand up. And so things that I think keep us as families, certainly the respect and the communication piece. But if you're running a business or you're part of a family and there's no plan and there's no clarity on the numbers, those two things I think are pillars in making succession work and getting those things right so that all participants in the succession process are really clear on the performance of the business, clear on the numbers, and then there is a really clear and concise documented plan for the business. They're important. And then, and we've touched on it, but having that really good communication framework. So right down to weekly meetings, monthly meetings, quarterly planning meetings, annual planning meetings, and having the things that are in and around succession as part of that communication rhythm. That's key. And then the other piece is, and you touched on this as well, Ruth, having a team structure, having people clear in their roles, having career paths for employed workers and for family members coming through, having career pathways, having performance reviews and a process for that. All of those things that are good business governance, when they're set in place, it means that 80 or 90% of the issues that families face can be sorted out through good business conduct, which again just gives succession so much more of a focus. So for those young farmers in this call that are on farm and trying to work out what part they can play in making the farm more likely to have a more constructive succession conversation, it'd be focus on financial acumen, make sure you've got a really clear and strong strategic plan, and you might need advisors and people to help you nail those two. Then it's about getting a really clear communication rhythm in place. And then it's about team structure and professional practices as a business. I hope that makes sense. And I think we've heard from Ruth to confirm that that worked successfully for her family.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. How about you, Ruth? Is there anything you'd like to pass on before we head into the questions?
Oh, not really, but that what Jeremy just said I thought was really great. And running as a business and being very focused on on good business practice. And I suppose we employ people, and it's probably different if you don't, but I think we've got great young people that work in our business, and they want a good place to work, and you can really make a great environment. And you've got to train people, and we do performance reviews and those and all that stuff. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but it is taking a professional approach to farming, and not just going day to day, I suppose.
And with that, Ben, just quickly, I think the younger generation, if we skill up in those things, there's so much value that we can bring to a farming family that might have had, as a last generation, have operated successfully, but without those professional disciplines. And that's where I think, there's a huge opportunity for Australian agriculture with our next generation coming through to support those farms that might have been amateur to nail these pieces and become highly professional. And gosh, we all know that's now, it's no longer an option. It's an absolute requirement that we do seriously look at how professional, how diligent, and how efficient our farms are.
Excellent. Good points, Jeremy. Thank you. Well, just before I hand, I think, over to Jordan, just a couple of things for me that I just wanted to highlight that hadn't really sort of to cement and highlight was, a couple of things for you to do straight away is go out and build your networks. You're the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with. You're surrounded with drongos, you'll end up being a drongo. I know that's not the technical term, but mentors. So go out and find people to learn from, go out and work for the right people, find the right jobs. Number 2, peers. Start to surround yourself with people that are going places and doing things that have good values that match yours. And also start to get to know your parents' professional advisors, accountants, lawyers, bankers, financial advisors. Go sit in those meetings and start to understand the vernacular, like the words they use, the language they use, etc. And the last one is don't just bail up mum and dad. in the yards, in the paddock, when you've just come out from mustering. Book a meeting, sit down, have a conversation with an agenda. And if you don't have family meetings, become the family meeting ninja. Become that person that actually makes the family have the meetings and then becomes a champion for that for the family. Because like with Ruth, if her mum hadn't been the champion of driving things forward, it would have been a much tougher process. So they're just my couple of thoughts. So yeah, I'll back over to Jordan with the questions.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben and Jeremy. That's been, excellent. Thank you for your advice. And Ruth, thank you for being so transparent with the group as well. I think that's been a leading way to allow people to, filter a few questions through. So I'll just start off with this one. So it says, what is your least confrontational way of beginning with discussion of succession, especially when there may already be yard talk?
Jeremy, do you want to jump into that one, mate?
Absolutely. So I touched on this before, I think, but I think what we want in succession is win-win outcomes. We want a win for us, a win for mum and dad, and a win for our siblings and their partners and all of that. But often when we think about win-win, we think about what we want to get out of it first. And then if we get that, then we're happy for other people to win. But I want to encourage you to think about the first W in win-win to be your parents. How can I give them and help them get what they want? And then how can I help my siblings and their families get what they want? And then once we've done that, how then can I get what I want? I think about if I go to a first date, and it's been a while, but if I go sitting there having a first date with someone and I'm interesting and I talk all about myself for 90 minutes, I don't get a second date. But if I turn up to that first date and I intently show interest in them and genuinely care for them and their well-being, I'm more likely to get a second date. So what I would say is arrive to that conversation grateful, respectful, compassionate, and deeply interested in what they want, and then walk away and think about how, as part of this process, can I help my parents and my siblings get what they want? Be selfless as you go in, as well as respectful and compassionate. And I think Ruth touched on it beautifully before. Just be completely patient. Sometimes we can neglect to respect our parents, but they have been around the block a few times. They've done depressions, high interest rates, droughts, floods, plagues. They've done it all. There's probably a reason they're a little bit conservative and gun shy. Understand that and be interested and respectful. And for me, that's the best way then to move into, opening up the opportunity for some more conversation.
I think that's great, Jeremy. And if I can just add in, the word is curiosity, I think is really good. I love the question, which is, hey, Dad, hey, Mum, I know we've had some issues with this in the past. Help me understand what concerns you the most. Help me understand. If you go into it with that type of a frame, and then let them talk, don't try and problem solve, just listen. And that's that curiosity Jeremy so beautifully articulated.
That was a great analogy, Jeremy. Ruth, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Oh, I think Ben and Jeremy are far more qualified to answer that. Yeah.
That's okay. This next question actually links in quite well with your comment about being a little bit older, and I guess having those skills to handle different scenarios versus maybe your brother that was a little bit younger and I guess may not have been at that stage. So a question came through saying, how best do you handle dealing with siblings where there may be significant age gaps and at different stages of life?
Ruth, you've dealt with that? Do you want to make some comments there?
Yeah, I could. How best to deal with siblings when there's? I think what Jeremy spoke about, having a professional approach. I think clearly defined roles, people having different parts of the business that they are managing and that they have responsibility for, so you're not treading on each other's toes. I think, yeah, I mean, you've got to respect your siblings for their I suppose when I'm thinking about my relationship with my brother, we have different skill sets, and generally, he'll respect my my decision making on things that I know far more about than him, and likewise the vice versa. But some of it's time, and from your 20s to your 30s, you change a lot. And I think, not blowing up and sitting on things and maybe thinking about a better way to talk things through, or rather than blowing up in the yards all the time. And we've all had our share of blow ups, but you usually don't get far. But I think time and people, people grow up over time. So that some of that helps.
And look, Ruth, and look, going back to when I was, using Jeremy's analogy of the accounting firm or the financial advice firm, I can remember, being the young one and everyone else being older than me. I was in my early 20s, and I wasn't the best person to be in that position at that stage. And I think if you run a professional organization, a professional business, you have regular family meetings, all those things that Jeremy talked about, running a proper operation, that will smooth out a lot of those problems, because people will be brought along for the professional ride, not the emotional ride. The ones that are a lot younger, I get there'll be some problems because they won't necessarily have the emotional regulation. They may not have the experience or maturity, but they'll learn it over time. And I think, as you said, Ruth, patience is really important with the younger ones. I do a lot of family strategic planning meetings where we've got kids, we've got 28-year-olds in a room with 16 and 17-year-olds. And it just has to be a little bit more patient, a little bit more thought, and let them have their say, and let them develop.
Perfect. Jeremy, do you have any comments around that? I think that's been quite well worded, though.
I agree. I think that's been answered really well. I could go on, but I'm mindful of time. So if there are other questions, I think
we do. Yeah, another one's come through, which I think you all could probably touch on, is, I guess, how do you value sweat equity, particularly given the strong appreciation in land prices in the last few years?
That's an interesting question.
Are you going to have a crack at that one, Ben?
I'm not sure how to answer that one. How do you value sweat equity?
Yeah, I'm happy to go there. There's no doubt that succession is amplified because we've seen land values appreciate. And if a farming family don't have off-farm investments or modest off-farm investments, it's pretty hard to work out how could we possibly give a large chunk of the asset over to one sibling and not others. The other dynamic, and I think that's what this question is touching on, is so often the younger generation on farms are underpaid and can work 5, 10, 15, 20 years on the farm on 40 grand a year and a house, and put everything they can, the sweat equity in. And then when we arrive to succession, that is discounted and not appreciated. And so for me, the way around that, even with inflated land values, is to pay a commercial wage to everyone in the business, employed and family. And as a bit of a side note, I think young family members coming through should have no special favours relative to the employed members of a farm team. They just need to be treated like that junior accountant coming through, whether they're family or not. But they need to be paid appropriately for their effort. 4 weeks holiday a year, super, all of those things. And as they progress, sure, they might get a ute and they might get, a bit of rent subsidy, but you only offer those things if you also offer it to your farm manager or your operations manager as they progress. When it comes 20 years down the track and that person has been underpaid for 20 years, I think when you do get your professional advisors around you, that should be taken into account. If I've been worked for 20 years on 40 grand and I'm now 30 and I'm doing a farm manager's wage, and most farm managers are getting paid 100 grand plus car plus house, there needs to be some calculations and that needs to be taken into consideration as part of any succession. So I just think, again, good business practice. If we just run a professional outfit, a vet practice would never pay one of their vets 50% of the going rate. They pay a good vet, they get a good result, and then when it gets to succession, there's not a balance up needed. But I think it's important that these things are absolutely taken into consideration if people are finding themselves working and contributing sweat equity rather than getting a full and proper remuneration. Ben?
Look. In the interest of time and getting to the next question, the only thing I'd probably add to that, Jeremy, would be if you are paid a market rate salary and you are doing well, you need to start building your own wealth outside of the farming business. So you need to start investing some of your wage, some of your salary into the farming business to protect yourself. So you're actually building your own wealth, and think like an entrepreneur and start thinking, well, how can I build this? Not just wait around for something to be transitioned to me.
Yeah, excellent. Great comments, guys. Really appreciate it. I think there's been some really good thoughts said. Well, I might wrap the questions up there.
I'd probably just want to, from my end, thank you all for the invite to come here and the privilege of being able to do it. I love listening to Jeremy. I love listening to Ruth's story. This is how we continually learn. My closing comment for me before I hand over to Jeremy and Ruth and back to you guys would be, my number one piece of advice to every person listening tonight is your number one obligation is to build your own personal value. So go out and get an education, get those skills, and that education could be professional education. It could be the School of Hard Knocks. Start thinking like a business owner and an entrepreneur and make yourself so employable, so that if your succession plan doesn't go quite to plan, or it's not what you thought it was, then you hit the marketplace and you'll be highly desirable. And I think Jeremy would probably confirm that pretty much every one of his members is probably looking for a bloody good farm manager. So worst case scenario, build your skills and work on you, not on everyone else.
Thank you very much. Some really great questions come through there. So many important takeaways from the discussion tonight. As you mentioned in the start, Ben, regardless of whether you're in a family business or not, there's so much crossover there, and translation across whatever part of the industry or role you have in the industry. Really big thank you to the three of you, Ben, Jeremy and Ruth. Jordan and myself and the wider committee have really enjoyed putting this together with you over the past couple of months in the lead up to tonight. I think it's important to note that the time and effort that the three of you have put in and volunteered to pull this together is, above and beyond expectation. And I think that it's a real testament to each of your commitment to the future of the beef industry as well. So thank you all so much for that.
Well, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast, the best thanks you can give us is to share the episode with your family and friends. So until next time, my name's Ben Law. I'm the Financial Bloke. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.